The sound of the alarm clock broke the silence at 5 a.m., as it always did. Carla stretched, her tired eyes slowly opening to the dim light of morning. She silenced the ringing clock before it could disturb the boys. Just 5 more minutes, she muttered to herself, her body begging for rest. But she knew she didn't have the luxury of those minutes. Every second mattered. Less sleep meant less money, and she couldn't afford to let time slip away. When she checked the clock again, she cursed under her breath. The 5 minutes had turned into 20, and panic flooded her chest. Jumping out of bed, she hurried to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in a desperate attempt to wake up. The boys' breakfast was already prepared, 2 peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, ready to go. She had made them the night before, knowing mornings like this would come. A note was placed beside their plates, one for each boy. Be good for MS. Davis. Love, Mom. Carla's neighbor, MS. Davis usually helped by watching the boys while Carla worked early shifts. But today, her phone rang before Carla had even finished brushing her teeth. The number was unfamiliar, but Carla answered anyway. Every call could be a potential opportunity. Hello, this is Carla. Am I speaking with Carla Peterson? A deep, formal voice asked on the other end. Yes, this is she. Carla's heart skipped a beat. This is Dana Grant from the Henson Estate. I received your resume for the permanent cleaning position. Carla's heart raced in her chest. This was the job she had been waiting for, the one that could give her the stability she so desperately needed. A steady paycheck, health insurance, the chance to offer her boys more than just peanut butter sandwiches. Oh my God, yes, Carla tried to sound calm, but the excitement bled through. I'm very interested in the position. Mr. Henson would like to interview you at 10 a.m. today. Would that be possible? Dana's voice was formal, but there was something warm behind it. Carla froze. She had planned for MS. Davis to watch the boys, but she couldn't. Her neighbor had called earlier and said she was too sick to help. I'll be there, Carla said quickly, though anxiety made her voice waver. Is it all right if I bring my kids? Hayri, 5-year-old twins. I promise they're well-behaved. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. It's not the usual policy, Dana said cautiously. But since it's just for the interview, I can make an exception. Mr. Henson is very particular about his routine. Thank you so much. I'll be there at 10, I promise, Carla replied, relief washing over her. She hung up, feeling a mix of anxiety and excitement. She looked down the hallway at her twins' bedroom door. Today was crucial. She needed to make a good impression. She had to remind them how important this day was. With one last glance at the clock, she hurried to wake them. Ethan, Liam, wake up. It's time to get ready. Carla called, trying to stay calm as she scrambled to get the boys dressed. The bus would be here soon, and they were already behind schedule. What's wrong, Mom? Are we going to be late? Ethan asked, his face full of concern as he squinted at the cloudy sky through the window. No, honey, Carla lied, giving him a quick hug. We're going to be fine. The bus was late, as usual. Carla held both Ethan's and Liam's hands tightly as they made their way to the bus stop. She glanced at her watch and inwardly groaned when she saw how far behind they were. We'll make it, she said with a forced smile, but her mind was already racing through the possibilities of how she could salvage the situation. Mom, Liam piped up, his small voice full of curiosity, is the big house where we're going for the job interview? Carla looked down at her son. Yes, sweetie. The Henson Estate is a very big house, and I'll be cleaning it if they hire me. I bet it's bigger than our house, Ethan said, always practical, looking up at the sky. Carla tried not to think about it too much. The mansion was massive, and she wasn't sure how she would manage it, but it was a chance for a better life. A better life for them. When they finally made it to the bus, Carla breathed a sigh of relief. The bus ride was a quiet one as Carla tried to keep the boys calm. Remember what we talked about, she whispered, looking at both of them. You need to be extra quiet while I talk to Mr. Henson. Don't touch anything in the house, okay? Like at the library? Liam asked, always trying to make sense of the rules. Exactly like the library. Just quieter, Carla said, trying to keep her voice steady. The twins nodded, their serious green eyes shining with determination. Carla couldn't help but feel a pang in her heart. They had grown up so fast since their father left 3 years ago. The Henson Estate came into view just as they were nearing the hilltop. The mansion was massive, towering over the surrounding trees with its stone walls and towering windows. It looked almost like something from a fairy tale, though without any of the warmth or charm. Carla couldn't help but shiver. "Mom, is that house owned by a king?" Liam asked, his voice full of awe as he tugged at Carla's sleeve. "No, sweetie." Carla smiled at her son, trying to reassure him. "That house belongs to a man named Mr. Henson. He needs someone to clean it, and I'm hoping to get that job." "It's huge. How can one person clean it all?" Ethan asked, ever the realist. Carla swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. "I'll figure out," she said, even though a part of her wasn't so sure. When they reached the gates, they were stopped by a security guard who eyed them with suspicion. Carla quickly explained the situation, and after a short radio call, the guard waved them through. The path through the estate was long, stretching out with perfectly manicured gardens, yet the absence of any flowers or color made the whole place feel cold and lifeless. It was beautiful, but it was missing something. "Mom, where are the flowers?" Liam asked, glancing around, puzzled. "Maybe in the back of the house," Carla said, though she doubted it. The place felt too sterile. When they finally arrived at the front door, a woman with perfectly styled gray hair greeted them. "Miss Peterson, I'm Dana Grant, the housekeeper. Mr. Henson will be with you shortly." "You're late," Dana said, glancing at her watch before softening her gaze to the twins. "These must be your children," Dana said as Ethan and Liam stood nervously by Carla's side. "Yes," Carla answered, her voice strained. "Ethan and Liam. Boys, say hello to MS. Grant." The twins chimed in unison, "Hello." Dana gestured for them to enter. "You can wait in the living room while Mr. Henson finishes his business. Please make sure they don't touch anything." Carla nodded as they walked into the room. The mansion's interior was as grand as the outside. The furniture was expensive looking, but everything felt impersonal, as though the place had never been lived in. The walls were neutral shades, and the floor gleamed as if it had never seen a day of use. It felt like a museum, not a home. Carla sat at the edge of a leather sofa, keeping her posture as stiff as possible to avoid leaving any marks on the cushions. The twins, on the other hand, weren't paying much attention. They stood beside her, their eyes wide with curiosity. Carla looked down at them, grateful for their relative quietness, and whispered again, "Remember, we need to stay super quiet, just like in the library." The minutes ticked by, and Carla nervously went over possible questions in her head. She desperately needed this job, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place in this vast, empty house. That's when she noticed the silence. Ethan and Liam weren't sitting by her anymore. Panic surged through her chest as she scanned the room for them. Where had they gone? "Ethan? Liam?" Carla called out, her voice rising slightly in panic. She jumped to her feet and began searching the mansion, walking quickly down a hallway. With every second, she felt her heart race faster. What would she say to Dana, or worse, Mr. Henson, if she had lost her children in this enormous, lifeless house? Then she heard them, small voices echoing from a room at the end of the hall. Carla let out a breath and ran toward the sound. When she reached the door of a large office, she froze. There, standing in front of the twins, was a tall man in a tailored suit, his sharp eyes focused on the boys. Carla was about to apologize when she heard Liam's voice. "Mr. Henson, you look sad. Do you want a hug?" Time seemed to stop. Thomas's face shifted through a range of emotions, from shock to discomfort, and then something Carla couldn't quite read. For a moment, he looked like he had been hit by something invisible. "No, I don't need hugs," he said finally, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "Everybody needs hugs," Ethan insisted, stepping forward. Carla rushed to them, her heart in her throat. "Ethan, Liam, come here right now," she called, trying not to sound frantic. All three of them looked at her, confused. Thomas didn't say anything as he watched her. "Miss Peterson," he said in a low voice, "I assume you're here for the cleaning position." Yes, sir, Carla responded, struggling to regain composure. These are my children, Ethan and Liam. Thomas studied them for a moment before turning his gaze back to her. Mrs. Grant informed me you're here for the job. And these are your children? Yes, Mr. Henson, Carla said, her voice slightly strained. I'm sorry I had to bring them, but I didn't have anyone else to watch them today. Thomas nodded, but said nothing more. He crossed his arms and appeared deep in thought, his gaze sweeping the room as though assessing its every detail. The estate is large, he began abruptly. 14 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 living rooms, and a library. The gardens are managed by an outside team, but the internal spaces are all your responsibility. Carla nodded as he rattled off the details. I've worked in hotels for 3 years, and I've cleaned private homes. I'm very organized, and I learn quickly, she said, trying to sound confident, though her heart was still racing. Thomas glanced at her with an unreadable expression. References? Carla's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder of recommendation letters from her previous employers. When she handed it over, Thomas looked at the folder for a moment before turning back to her. That won't be necessary. Carla blinked, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Excuse me? You're hired. Carla felt her heart stop for a moment. Had she heard him correctly? Carla stood frozen, her mind unable to catch up with what had just happened. Thomas Henson, the man who had seemed so distant, cold, and commanding just moments before, had said the word she had hoped for but never expected. You're hired. It took a second for the reality of it to sink in. Carla blinked, her heart pounding. She had been desperate for a stable job, one that would offer benefits, a steady paycheck, and peace of mind for her boys. But to be hired on the spot, without even a reference check or a trial period, it was almost too good to be true. Wait, what? Carla whispered, barely able to process the words. I'm hired, she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Thomas Henson nodded, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. Yes, we'll start on Monday. You can report at 8 a.m. Mrs. Grant will show you around the estate and explain your duties. Carla didn't know what to say. She had to take a moment to regain her composure. This job could change everything for her and her sons. No more worrying about late rent, no more scrambling for last-minute jobs. She could finally breathe a little easier. Thank you. Carla finally managed, her voice shaky but sincere. Thank you so much. Thomas gave a slight nod, but his attention quickly shifted, and it was clear the conversation was over. He turned back to his desk, picking up a pen and returning to his work. Carla felt a strange mixture of relief and discomfort. He didn't seem to acknowledge her gratitude. He simply moved on as if the decision hadn't been anything remarkable. For him, perhaps it wasn't. But for Carla, it was everything. Her eyes moved to the twins, still standing by her side, their innocent eyes wide with curiosity. They hadn't understood much of what had just transpired, but they knew that something important had happened. Ethan tugged at her sleeve. Mom, is the big man our boss now? He asked. Carla smiled down at her son, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to spill over. Yes, sweetie. Mr. Henson is our boss now. Liam, ever the more thoughtful of the two, asked, Is it going to stay sad like that forever? Carla's heart skipped a beat at her son's innocent question. Is he going to stay sad like that forever? She wasn't sure how to answer. She hadn't seen Mr. Henson smile once since she had met him, but somehow those words from Liam had left her unsettled. Could a hug from a child truly break through the walls that had clearly been built up over the years? I don't know. Honey, Carla replied softly, brushing her fingers through Liam's messy hair. I think sometimes people just need time. With that, they were escorted out of the office by Mrs. Grant, who seemed just as surprised as Carla by how quickly everything had happened. The housekeeper, who had remained a silent observer during the interview, led them back down the hallway toward the front entrance. Don't worry, Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Grant said, her voice filled with an almost knowing warmth. Mr. Henson may be a bit a hard man, but he's fair. You'll do well here. I'll make sure of it. Carla gave her a small, grateful smile, though a part of her couldn't shake the unease that had crept in. The mansion was massive, intimidating even. Everything in it looked pristine, untouched, as if it belonged to a world that didn't quite connect with hers. She could already sense that her life here would be a far cry from the humble apartment she and the boys had called home. The walk to the exit was quiet, the only sound being the echo of their footsteps through the long, empty halls of the mansion. As they stepped outside, the cool air hit Carla's face, and she inhaled deeply, as though trying to breathe in some of the freedom she had longed for. The twins, full of energy and excitement, ran ahead to the waiting car. Carla watched them for a moment, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and worry. This was the opportunity she had fought for, and now it was time to face it head on. But even as she felt a sense of relief that the pressure of job hunting was over, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that she was entering a world she didn't quite understand. The weekend flew by in a blur of preparation. Carla spent every free moment organizing and strategizing for her new routine. She had arranged for Ms. Davis, her neighbor, to watch the boys until she could get them into a more permanent daycare situation. It was going to be a struggle, money would be tight, especially for the first month, but it would be worth it. This was the break she had been waiting for. Monday arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that made Carla want to pull the covers back over her head and hide. But she had no choice. This was her first day at the mansion. She had to make a good impression. Ethan and Liam were already up, dressed in their best clothes for the day, excited about the new chapter that had begun. They didn't fully understand how significant this moment was, but Carla was determined to make sure they knew that they were part of something big. "Mom, today's the day, right?" Ethan asked, looking up at her with bright eyes. "That's right, honey," Carla replied, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Today's the big day." After a quick breakfast, she ushered the boys out the door, making sure they had everything they needed for the day. They were going to spend the morning with Ms. Davis, and Carla had promised to bring them a surprise when she came back. She hoped she'd make it through her first day without any major disasters. When Carla arrived at the mansion, she felt her heart race again. The place was even more imposing in the daylight, with the sun casting long shadows over the gardens. The security guard greeted her, as usual, recognizing her now, and gave her a quick wave. It felt strangely routine, as if this had all become part of the process. Yet Carla couldn't help but feel that everything about this place was too perfect, too calculated. Alice Grant was waiting for her at the back door, as expected, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Miss Peterson. You're on time." "That's good," Alice said, her tone neutral, though there was a small hint of approval in her voice. Carla nodded. "I wouldn't miss it. Let me show you to the staff room so you can change. Then we'll go over your duties for the day," Alice continued, leading her through the kitchen and down a long corridor. The mansion, although grand and beautiful, felt more like a machine than a home. The staff room was small but well-equipped. A simple uniform in light gray was laid out on the bench, along with a pair of clean white shoes. Carla quickly changed into the outfit, smoothing down the fabric before meeting Alice back in the hallway. The whole process felt like an induction into a foreign world. "We'll start in the dining room today," Alice instructed as she led Carla through the mansion. "Mr. Henson likes everything to be spotless. Every surface should shine, and don't leave any streaks." Carla nodded as Alice went on with the list of rules and regulations, detailing which products to use on which surfaces and the order in which to clean the rooms. As Alice spoke, Carla felt her nerves ease a little. This wasn't much different from what she had done before, just on a much larger scale. Still, the pressure of working in such an enormous place, surrounded by the wealth and grandeur of the Henson Estate, felt overwhelming. Carla followed Alice to the dining room, the first area she would clean. The table was so large it could seat over 20 people, and it gleamed as though no one had ever used it. Carla couldn't help but wonder how often Mr. Henson had guests, and if they ever actually sat at the table. The whole room had a cold, lifeless feel to it, much like the rest of the house. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning and dusting. The mansion was pristine, and it didn't take long for Carla to get into a rhythm. But as the day wore on, she began to notice the strange stillness in the air. It wasn't the kind of silence that was calming. It was heavy, suffocating, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence wasn't just in the air, it was in the people too. Alice moved through the mansion like a ghost, her footsteps barely audible, her eyes always scanning the rooms for any imperfections. The gardener, the one person who came in regularly, was just as silent. It was as though everyone who worked here had learned to keep their presence as invisible as possible. It was unnerving. Carla paused in the library, taking a break from cleaning the shelves. The room was vast, lined with books that no one seemed to ever read. The air in a library felt thick with silence. She looked out the large window, admiring the garden below. It was beautiful, meticulously maintained, but it had the same cold feel as everything else in the house. Is this what the world of the rich is like? Carla wondered aloud to herself. Just as she was about to continue working, she heard footsteps approaching. Carla stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat. It was Mr. Henson, stepping into the library with his usual cool demeanor. He looked around, his eyes scanning the shelves. "How is everything going?" he asked, his voice low, but there was a hint of curiosity in it. Carla froze for a moment. She hadn't expected to see him here so soon. "It's going well, Mr. Henson," she managed, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I see," he said, his eyes still scanning the room. "I trust you're adjusting to the mansion's needs." Carla nodded. "I'm getting the hang of it." Thomas Henson paused for a moment, as though contemplating something, before nodding once and turning to leave. But before he did, he looked back at her with something like a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was fleeting, gone before Carla could place it. He didn't say anything else. But the brief exchange left her with a strange feeling in her chest. What was it about this man that made him feel both so distant and so familiar at the same time? And why did she feel as though she was part of something larger than just cleaning the mansion? Carla finished the last of her cleaning chores as the sun began to set. By the time she made her way back to the staff room to change, she was exhausted. Her hands ached from the hours of scrubbing, her back sore from bending over so much. But as tired as she was, there was a sense of accomplishment in her heart. She was one step closer to making a better life for her boys. This job could be everything they had ever dreamed of. The mansion, though, still felt like a hollow shell. The emptiness in its walls seemed to seep into everything around it. But as Carla walked out the front door to catch the bus home, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. Not just for her family, but for Mr. Henson too. Somehow, in the midst of all the stillness and silence, she sensed that the mansion wasn't as lifeless as it seemed. Something was stirring, something that Carla couldn't quite explain. She only hoped that, when the time came, she would be ready to face whatever came next. The next few weeks at the Henson Estate unfolded with an eerie predictability. Every morning, Carla arrived at exactly 8 a.m., as instructed, and was greeted by the same silent routine. The mansion, with its towering walls and endless corridors, felt more like a labyrinth than a home. Every room she cleaned, every surface she polished, was as pristine and untouched as the last. But the silence that permeated the halls was the most unsettling part. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty house. It was a stillness that felt like a burden, like something had been lost, and no one was willing to speak about it. Carla, however, kept her head down. She focused on the work, trying not to let the weight of the mansion's somber atmosphere get to her. She had a job to do, and the boys were depending on her. Every day she returned home exhausted, but also strangely fulfilled. It was hard work, but it was stable, and for the first time in a long while, Carla could imagine a future that didn't revolve around constant uncertainty. At first, Thomas Henson remained a distant figure, always locked away in his office. His presence barely felt except for the occasional brief interaction. He would emerge around noon, briefly passing through the grand hallways with his stern expression before retreating back to his office. It was clear he was a man consumed by his work, someone who barely seemed to notice the world around him. Carla couldn't help but wonder how long he had been like this. His cold, distant demeanor seemed unnatural. And yet, there were glimpses, small moments when he'd look at her or the twins, and for just a fraction of a second, something unspoken flickered in his eyes. One particular afternoon, as Carla was cleaning the massive library, she noticed him standing at the entrance, observing her work. He hadn't said anything yet, but there was something different in the air that day. The usual silence was interrupted by the soft sound of his footsteps approaching. Carla stopped, dusting the bookshelves, her heart racing. She had been trying not to think about Mr. Henson too much, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. But there was something about him, something that made her want to understand why he acted the way he did. Miss Peterson, Thomas's voice was deep, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. How are you adjusting to the work here? Carla glanced up, surprised by the directness of his question. She had expected him to remain distant, as he usually did. I'm managing Mr. Henson, Carla replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though a part of her was nervous. Thank you for asking. Everything is going well. Thomas didn't respond immediately, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He didn't look at her, but his attention seemed to focus on the space around them, the large, empty bookshelves, the heavy silence that filled the room. It was as though he was looking for something, or perhaps trying to find something to say that wouldn't sound too personal. There's a certain quiet here, isn't there? He said suddenly, his voice softer than before. Too much quiet. It's unsettling. Carla froze, unsure how to respond. Was he talking about the mansion? Or was he speaking about himself? Yes, it's different, Carla said cautiously. I suppose it takes some getting used to. Thomas's gaze flicked to her for a brief moment before he nodded. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the mansion. Carla watched him go, her thoughts racing. What had that exchange meant? What was it about the quiet that bothered him so much? She couldn't help but wonder about the man behind the cold exterior, the man who had hired her on the spot, who had been so distant, yet who now seemed to acknowledge the very thing that made this place so haunting. Days turned into weeks, and while the mansion still felt like a mausoleum of forgotten memories, Carla began to notice subtle shifts in Mr. Henson's behavior. It wasn't just the occasional glance or the brief acknowledgement. Every now and then, she'd see him standing by the window, staring out at the garden, his gaze distant as though he was searching for something in the world beyond the estate's high walls. But it was the children who seemed to have the most effect on him. The twins, with their boundless energy and innocence, had a way of drawing him out of his shell, even if just for a moment. One day, as Carla finished dusting the dining room, she overheard the twins talking as they played in the hallway. Liam was asking questions, as usual, his curiosity never seeming to end. Mom says Mr. Henson is really serious, Liam said, his voice low, as though he was trying to figure out the man's moods. He's not always serious, Ethan replied, ever the realist. Sometimes he looks like he's sad. I think he needs more hugs. Carla stopped dead in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. Liam's words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just the innocent statement from a child. It was the observation of someone who had an uncanny ability to read people, to understand things that adults often missed. She thought back to the first day she had brought the twins to the mansion. She remembered how Mr. Henson had reacted when Liam had offered him a hug. It had been an uncomfortable moment. But now, looking back, Carla realized that maybe the twins had been onto something. Maybe there was more to Thomas Henson than met the eye. He wasn't just a cold businessman. He was a man who had lost something precious, something he couldn't seem to let go of. After that day, Carla began to notice more subtle changes in the mansion's atmosphere. The silence was still overwhelming, but it wasn't quite as oppressive. Thomas began leaving his office more frequently, though it was always brief. He'd appear in the kitchen, grabbing a quick snack, or sometimes he'd be seen walking the grounds, his eyes searching the perfectly manicured garden as if looking for something. And once or twice, she caught him watching the boys as they ran and played outside, a wistful look on his face. It was as though the presence of the children was slowly pulling him out of the deep well of grief he had buried himself in. One afternoon, after another long day of cleaning, Carla was preparing to leave when she noticed the twins standing in front of the large windows of the mansion's indoor garden. It was an overcast day, the sky thick with clouds, but the sight of the children standing there, peering out into the lush greenery, filled her with an inexplicable sense of peace. The garden, though beautifully manicured, had always seemed a bit too perfect, its geometric shapes and trimmed hedges giving it a sterile, lifeless quality. But as she looked at the twins, their small faces pressed against the glass, she saw it in a new light. They had found something in the garden that even she had overlooked, the possibility of life, of wonder, even in the most controlled environments. As Carla approached, she heard Liam's voice. "Look, Mom, there's a rabbit." Ethan's face lit up with excitement as he pointed toward a corner of the garden. "It's so fluffy." Carla smiled softly, her heart warming as she watched them. The sight of her children in this grand, empty place seemed to give it a bit of soul, a bit of life that had been missing before. She was about to say something when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Thomas Henson standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the children. For a moment, no one spoke. The twins continued to watch the rabbit, completely unaware of the silent exchange between their mother and Mr. Henson. Thomas stood still, as though absorbing the simple joy of the moment. Then, without warning, he spoke. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Thomas's voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. Carla blinked in surprise. "You mean the boys?" Thomas nodded. "They're different. They have something I haven't seen in a long time." Carla's heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never noticed before. It was fleeting, but it was there. He was trying, in his own way, to reach out, to acknowledge something that had been lost in him for years. "I think they're going to be fine," Carla said softly. "They're strong, and they'll help you too." Thomas didn't respond, but he gave a slight nod before turning to leave. As he walked away, Carla felt a strange sense of connection between them. Something unspoken, something they both understood, but neither could put into words. That evening, as Carla and the twins boarded the bus home, she felt a strange sense of peace settle in her chest. The mansion was still vast and intimidating, but now it seemed a little less cold, a little less empty. She had made it through another day, and somehow, things were starting to change. As the bus rumbled down the road, Carla looked out the window at the fading lights of the Henson Estate, the mansion standing tall against the darkening sky. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The past was behind her, and the future was full of possibilities, even if they were just beginning to take shape. The days turned into weeks, and as Carla settled further into her role at the Henson Estate, a strange sense of routine began to take hold. The work itself wasn't difficult, but it was exhausting, and the mansion's oppressive silence was beginning to wear on her. Yet, amidst all of it, there were moments of unexpected warmth, like when the twins would burst through the front door after school, eager to explore every nook and cranny of the estate, or when Thomas would leave his office for the briefest of moments to check in on them. For reasons Carla couldn't fully understand, the children had become a bridge between the cold world of the mansion and the quiet, lost man who ran it. Though Mr. Henson was still a figure of distant authority, Carla had started to notice small changes in him. He would occasionally speak to her when they crossed paths, and though his words were always brief and businesslike, there was a certain softness to his voice that hadn't been there before. And the way he looked at the twins, though he still maintained his usual distance, seemed to be a bit less cold. The twins, too, were starting to notice the difference. Ethan, more perceptive than his younger brother, had picked up on the subtle shifts long before Carla did. "Mom," he said one evening, as they sat around the dinner table in their small apartment, "I think Mr. Henson is starting to like us." Carla paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She hadn't really thought about it, but now that Ethan had mentioned it, she could see it too. "What makes you think that, sweetie?" "He's not as grumpy anymore," Ethan replied, his eyes narrowing in that thoughtful way he always did when he was figuring something out. And he lets us talk to him more now. Carla smiled, ruffling his hair. You might be right. The twins have been spending more time with Thomas, either playing outside in the garden or showing him their drawings. Liam had made a habit of leaving small pictures for him on his desk, colorful scribbles with stick figures of Mr. Henson, the mansion, and the boys with the words Mr. Henson is happy written in their childish scrawl. At first, Carla had been unsure whether Thomas would even notice the drawings, but to her surprise, he had. One afternoon, as Carla was cleaning the main hallway, she noticed Thomas standing by the window, looking out into the garden. The twins were running around, playing some sort of game, their laughter echoing through the open space. For a moment, Thomas stood there silently, his gaze following the children's every move. Carla hesitated, unsure if she should speak or simply leave him to his thoughts. But just as she was about to turn away, Thomas spoke. They remind me of my son. His voice was barely above a whisper, as though he hadn't meant to say it out loud. James used to run around like that, full of energy. He was 5, just like them. Carla's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him mention his son before, and the rawness in his voice caught her off guard. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. I didn't know, she said quietly, not knowing how else to respond. Thomas sighed, his gaze shifting back to the children. It's been a long time since I've seen that kind of joy. I didn't realize how much I missed it. Carla's heart ached for him, for the grief he must have carried for so long. But she also felt a sense of connection to him in that moment. They were both parents, both burdened by the weight of loss. And in some strange way, the twins had become the common thread that connected them. As the weeks passed, the routine at the mansion became more familiar. Carla arrived every morning at 8 a.m., just as she had been instructed. She cleaned and polished the vast spaces of the estate, moving through the grand halls, the cold marble floors echoing beneath her footsteps. The work was monotonous, but there was a sense of purpose to it. It wasn't just about cleaning, it was about maintaining the house, making it shine, bringing life back to a place that had long been forgotten. The twins continued to spend their afternoons with Ms. Davis, the neighbor, though they also spent time in the mansion, exploring the rooms and running around the gardens, much to Thomas's apparent discomfort. But it wasn't just the children who were changing the atmosphere of the estate. It was Carla, too. The way she interacted with the space, the way she moved through it, seemed to breathe a bit of warmth into the coldness that had once defined it. One afternoon, as Carla was polishing the grand staircase, she noticed that Thomas had left his office and was standing at the top of the stairs, watching her. His usual cold demeanor was still present, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of something that resembled curiosity. Carla, he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I wanted to ask you, how are the boys adjusting? Are they settling in? Carla was caught off guard by the question. She had never expected him to ask about her children, let alone seem genuinely interested in their well-being. She paused for a moment before answering. They're doing well, she said, her voice steady. They really enjoy the time they spend here, especially in the garden. I think they're starting to like it here more than I expected. Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on the children outside. Good. They deserve to feel happy. Carla couldn't help but notice how different his tone was. There was no trace of the icy reserve that had marked their previous interactions. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of something in him, a vulnerability, a longing, maybe even a trace of hope. They're a handful, but they're good kids, Carla added, smiling softly as she thought about how the boys had started drawing pictures for Thomas. They've taken a liking to leaving their drawings for you. Thomas's lips twitched, almost as if he was fighting a smile. I've noticed. They're very creative. They are, Carla agreed, her smile widening. They've got big imaginations. As Thomas turned and walked back to his office, Carla felt an odd sense of satisfaction. She wasn't sure if it was the conversation itself or the fact that Mr. Henson had opened up, even just a little, but something had shifted between them. For the first time, it felt like they were starting to understand each other, not just as employer and employee, but as people. One day, as Carla was wrapping up her work for the day, she noticed something on the kitchen counter. It was a small wooden box, neatly placed in the center. The lid was intricately carved, and as Carla approached, she felt a sense of intrigue. She opened it cautiously, and inside, she found a collection of antique toy soldiers. They were beautifully crafted, each one painted with incredible detail, as though they had been made for someone who cherished them deeply. Alice Grant, who had appeared beside her, watched her closely. They belonged to Mr. Henson, Alice said softly, almost as if sharing a secret. He used to play with them when he was a boy. He wanted you to have them for the boys. Carla felt a lump form in her throat. This was the first time Mr. Henson had given them anything, and it was clear that it wasn't just a simple gift. It was something much more personal. He wanted them to play with these? Carla asked, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alice replied with a small smile. I think he's starting to realize that there's more to life than just work and silence. He's starting to see the importance of family again. Carla's eyes stung with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. She had never expected something like this from Thomas Henson, and yet here it was, a gesture that spoke volumes about his willingness to change, to allow others into his life once more. Thank you, Carla said, carefully closing the box and placing it in her bag. I'll make sure the boys take good care of them. As she left the mansion that evening, the weight of the day began to settle in. The estate had always felt cold and lifeless, but now, as she walked past the manicured gardens and the towering walls, she could almost sense the change. There was something shifting, something quietly evolving. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and grief, was beginning to feel like a place where healing was possible. Not just for Thomas, but for all of them. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time, Carla believed that it could be something worth fighting for. That evening, as Carla tucked the twins into bed, she couldn't help but think about the future. The boys were adjusting, slowly but surely. They had begun to look forward to their visits to the mansion, and each day brought new discoveries, new moments of connection with Mr. Henson. But even as things seemed to be shifting for the better, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. There was an unspoken tension that lingered, a deep well of grief that Thomas had yet to fully confront. Carla knew that sooner or later, the past would have to be addressed, and she wasn't sure what that would mean for them all. For now, though, she allowed herself to breathe, to focus on the small victories, the smiles on the twins' faces, the softening of Mr. Henson's cold demeanor, and the faint hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they were all moving towards something better. As she closed the door to the twins' room and sat down in the quiet of the apartment, Carla couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter would bring. The mansion had changed, not just in the way it felt, but in the way it looked. The sterile silence that had once hung in the air like a heavy fog now seemed less oppressive, almost bearable. Every day that passed, it felt as though the house was slowly coming back to life. And for that, Carla couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had not just brought order to this place. She had breathed a subtle warmth into its hollow walls. The twins continued to thrive, their laughter ringing through the vast corridors, filling the empty spaces with the sound of life. Even Thomas Henson, who had once seemed like a man impossible to reach, now appeared differently. The few times he stepped out of his office, he seemed more present, more aware of the world around him. He even took the time to greet the boys occasionally, his demeanor less stony, as if he were slowly shedding the armor that had protected him for so long. Yet, despite the small but meaningful shifts in Thomas's behavior, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something still lay beneath the surface. His small gestures, the way he looked at the children, the way he had given them the wooden soldiers, hinted at a deeper connection. But there were still moments when she saw him withdraw, when the coldness returned to his eyes, when the shadow of his past seemed to loom over him. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the gardens, Carla took a moment to step outside for some fresh air. It had been a long day of cleaning and organizing, and she needed a brief respite before heading home to the twins. She stood near the garden's edge, gazing out at the perfectly trimmed hedges and the still, quiet pond in the distance. The silence of the estate felt soothing at that moment, a stark contrast to the constant noise of her life back home. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Thomas Henson walking up beside her until he spoke. "You're becoming quite the expert on the estate," Thomas said, his voice breaking the silence in a way that didn't feel harsh, but rather calm, almost conversational. Carla turned to look at him, surprised to see him so close. His usual distance dissolved for a moment. "I'm just doing my job," she replied with a faint smile. "Though I have to admit, it's starting to feel a little more like home." Thomas seemed to consider her words for a moment. He glanced over at the twins, who were playing in the garden, their voices filled with excitement as they ran around. For a moment, his expression softened. "They've made a difference," Thomas said, his voice quieter, almost to himself. Carla looked up at him, studying his face, trying to understand the weight behind his words. "The twins?" she asked gently, her gaze shifting to where they were running. Thomas nodded, his eyes still focused on them. "They remind me of what I used to have. The laughter, the life." He trailed off, and for a moment, Carla thought he might say more, but instead he turned his gaze back to her. Carla hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had never heard Thomas speak about his past this way, so openly, without the usual walls that surrounded him. She wanted to ask more, to understand what he had lost, but something told her that pushing too hard might close him off again. "You know," Carla said, breaking the silence, "you don't have to be alone in this. You don't have to carry it all on your own." Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped, as though unsure of how to proceed. Instead, he gave a small nod, and the silence stretched between them once again. This time, though, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the two of them were sharing a quiet understanding. "I appreciate what you've done for this place," Thomas said finally. "For them." He nodded towards the twins. "And for me." Carla smiled softly. "We're all just doing the best we can." Despite the warmth of their brief exchange, Carla couldn't shake the lingering feeling that there were parts of Thomas's past that he still hadn't come to terms with. The way his demeanor would shift so quickly, the way he retreated into himself after moments of connection. It was clear that the grief he had buried so deeply was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. The twins had unknowingly begun to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. Their innocence, their kindness, had become a beacon of light that reached him in ways that Carla could not. But even with their efforts, there were times when he would withdraw, retreating into the mansion's cold halls, as if trying to distance himself from the very thing that was healing him. One afternoon, after another long day of work, Carla decided to take a different approach. She wanted to understand him better, if only so she could help him. She found herself standing in front of his office door, the same door she had passed countless times without a second thought. But today was different. Today, something in her gut told her that now was the time. Carla hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She had never done anything like this before, invading his space, pushing past his boundaries. But for some reason, she felt compelled to try. She knocked softly, almost in fear that her intrusion would shatter the fragile rapport they had built. After a moment, she heard his voice, soft but firm, calling her in. Carla stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas was standing by his desk, his back turned to her, but she could tell he was aware of her presence. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Carla said, her voice hesitant. Thomas turned slowly, his eyes locking with hers. For a brief moment, Carla saw the flicker of something, vulnerability, perhaps, or something deeper. He said nothing, just nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, Carla." She took a deep breath, her nerves starting to settle. As she sat down, she tried to keep her voice steady. "I just wanted to check in," Carla began, "to see how you're doing. You've been quiet lately." Thomas didn't answer immediately, but she could see his eyes harden slightly. It wasn't the coldness of before, but it was still a shield, something he used to protect himself. "I'm fine," he said, his voice measured, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Carla didn't push. She wasn't here to force him to open up. She simply wanted him to know that she cared, that he didn't have to go through everything alone. "You don't have to do this by yourself," she said softly. "We're all in this together. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Thomas's gaze softened, and for the briefest of moments, Carla saw something flicker in his eyes, a glimmer of relief. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the familiar coolness. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone neutral. "But I'm fine." Carla nodded, standing up to leave. "I'll let you get back to your work." As she reached the door, Thomas spoke again. "Thank you, Carla." Her hand paused on the door handle, and she looked back at him, surprised by the genuine gratitude in his voice. "You're welcome," she said softly. "Really." With that, she left his office, her heart heavy with the knowledge that he wasn't as fine as he let on. But for the first time, Carla felt like she had made a small crack in the wall Thomas had built around himself. And that was something. Later that evening, as Carla sat in the small kitchen of their apartment, watching the twins chatter excitedly about their day, she couldn't help but think about Thomas. The mansion was still a mystery to her, and Thomas was still a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. But one thing was clear. The walls that had once kept him locked away were beginning to crumble. And with each small shift, Carla began to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him yet. The next morning, when Carla arrived at the mansion, she couldn't shake the sense that something was different. The air was heavier, charged with an anticipation she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the usual coldness of the place. It was something more. Something was about to change, and she wasn't sure if it was going to be for the better. But whatever it was, she knew she had to be ready. She had already come too far to back out now. As the day wore on, Carla worked with an intensity that surprised even her. She moved through the halls, focusing on each task, each chore, as though she were preparing for something. Something big. The storm, Carla thought as she wiped down the grand staircase. It's coming. And when it does, everything will change. The mansion felt different today. There was an undeniable tension hanging in the air, something Carla couldn't put her finger on. The usual silence, which had once felt like an oppressive force, now seemed to hum with something else, an anticipation, a quiet before the storm. The twins were running around outside, as usual, their laughter echoing through the garden, but even they seemed to sense it. There was a restlessness in the air, a feeling that something was about to change, though no one could have known exactly what that change would look like. Carla tried to shake off the feeling as she moved through her daily tasks. She polished the marble floors, wiped down the enormous windows, and dusted the countless shelves lined with books. But today, her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Henson and the way he had looked at her in the office yesterday. There had been something raw in his gaze, a momentary flicker of vulnerability. For the first time, she felt like he was letting her see more of who he really was, as though the walls were starting to crack. But even as she felt this shift, she knew that something deeper still lurked beneath the surface. Thomas hadn't been around much that morning. As usual, he had retreated to his office, leaving Carla to her work. He would appear for lunch, perhaps, and then disappear again. It was the routine, the system he had created to avoid anything that might make him confront the past. Carla had seen him like this for weeks, avoiding confrontation, retreating into his fortress of solitude. But today there was an undeniable shift. Something was happening. Around noon, as Carla was finishing up in the kitchen, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the light streaming in from the hallway. His expression was unreadable, as usual, but there was something different about him today. He wasn't retreating into his usual coldness. There was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, a trace of something Carla couldn't identify. "Carla." Thomas's voice was low, almost tentative. "I need to speak with you." Carla's heart skipped a beat, her palms growing slightly clammy. She nodded, setting down the dish she had been washing and wiping her hands on a towel. "Of course, Mr. Henson. What's on your mind?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, glancing at the twins, who were now sitting in the garden, coloring with crayons on the table. They were blissfully unaware of the tension that was building in the mansion, completely absorbed in their own little world. "I'm sorry to interrupt their time outside," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "But I need to talk to you alone." Carla nodded again, more out of habit than understanding, and motioned for him to follow her. She led him into the sitting room, a large space with grand furniture and high, arched windows that overlooked the estate. It was still cold, but Carla had long since grown accustomed to its vast emptiness. She sat down first, watching as Thomas settled into the armchair opposite her. He sat there for a moment, not speaking, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Carla's mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. Was he finally going to open up about his past? Was this the moment where everything changed? "Carla," Thomas began again, his voice low, "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything, about this place, about you, about my life. And I realize that I've been avoiding things. People. Life, really." Carla held her breath. She had never heard him speak so openly before. There was no shield, no icy barrier in place. His words were raw, almost desperate. "I've built this wall around myself," Thomas continued, his voice growing more strained. "A wall to protect myself from the pain of losing Catherine and James. And I thought if I just buried it deep enough, I could pretend it wasn't there. That I could just work and ignore everything else." Carla felt a pang of sympathy for him. This was the first time she had heard him acknowledge the grief that had clearly consumed him for so long. She sat up straighter, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to keep carrying it alone," Carla said softly. "You've been through something unimaginable. It's okay to let someone in." Thomas looked at her, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to find the right words. "I thought I was okay. I thought I could just keep going, keep hiding. But it's not working anymore. And I can't keep pretending." Carla felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she saw the pain and vulnerability in his eyes. He was finally letting her in, and for the first time, she saw him not as a cold businessman, but as a man who had been broken by loss. She had always known there was more to him than met the eye, but now she understood. He was human, and the grief he carried was something no one could fix overnight. "Mr. Henson," Carla said softly, her voice laced with empathy. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but I can be here for you. The twins, they've brought life back into this house, but you don't have to shut yourself away anymore. You're not alone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence hung between them like a heavy fog, but this time it felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was a shared understanding. "I don't know how to move on," Thomas said finally, his voice breaking just slightly. "I don't know how to be okay, but I think maybe it's time to try." Carla nodded, her heart swelling with empathy. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. It's a process, and it's okay to take small steps." Thomas stood up suddenly, the momentary vulnerability disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. He turned away, pacing slightly, as if trying to collect his thoughts. "I've been so focused on surviving, on keeping everything perfect and orderly, that I forgot what it means to live." Carla stood up too, walking toward him. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you. The twins, they love being here, and they love you, even if they don't understand everything. They remind me of what's important, what I've been missing." Thomas turned to face her, his expression still conflicted, but softer than before. "And you," he said, his voice steady now, "you've changed everything. You brought life back into this place. You brought them back, and I can't thank you enough for that." Carla gave him a small smile, her heart lifting at his words. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing my job, and I'm glad I'm here. For all of you." As the days passed, Carla noticed a subtle shift in Thomas. He no longer retreated into his office for hours on end. Instead, he would occasionally come out, joining her in the garden to watch the twins play, or even sitting with them in the kitchen, exchanging a few quiet words. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The walls he had built around himself were slowly starting to crumble, bit by bit. Carla couldn't deny that it felt like something was changing, not just for Thomas, but for everyone in the mansion. The twins had become a catalyst for this shift, But Carla knew that there was still work to be done. Thomas needed time, and so did she. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. As the days turned into weeks, the mansion no longer felt like a place of cold, lonely isolation. It was becoming a real home, with life and laughter and the faint hope of healing. And for the first time in years, Thomas Henson was beginning to let himself believe in the possibility of a future beyond grief. It was one afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, that Thomas did something unexpected. He called Carla into his office, but this time, it wasn't for a conversation about cleaning or the estate. When she entered, she found him standing by his desk, holding something in his hands. "This is for you," Thomas said, his voice steady but with a trace of uncertainty. Carla frowned, surprised. "For me? What is it?" Thomas handed her a small, intricately carved box. It was wooden, with delicate patterns etched along the sides, and it felt heavy in her hands. Carla opened it slowly, and inside, she found a set of antique keys. She looked up at him, confused. "They're keys to the second floor," Thomas explained, his eyes fixed on her. "I want you to have access to the entire mansion. You don't need to ask me anymore. It's yours, too." For a moment, Carla was speechless. The gesture was simple, but it meant everything. In that moment, she realized that Thomas wasn't just offering her the keys to a house. He was offering her something much more valuable: trust. The mansion, once a place of isolation and grief, was becoming a home, one they could all share. "Thank you," Carla said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise I'll take good care of it." Thomas nodded, his face softening. "I know you will." And with that, Carla knew that the future, whatever it might hold, was no longer as uncertain as it once seemed. It was a future that could be shaped by healing, by understanding, and by the quiet moments of connection that had started to define their lives. The mansion had always been an imposing structure, but over the past few weeks, it felt less like a fortress of solitude and more like a living, breathing entity. The air, once thick with silence and loss, had begun to shift, filled now with small moments of connection and understanding. Thomas had started to leave his office more frequently, making brief appearances at lunch or during the afternoon, walking through the garden with the twins, or even sitting at the kitchen table while they ate. It wasn't much, but for Thomas, it was a breakthrough. Carla, too, felt the change. At first, she had tried to keep her distance, unsure of how much she could push without overstepping. But as the days passed, she began to feel less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged in this strange, beautiful, and haunted place. The twins had woven their joy into the fabric of the mansion, and somehow, in their innocent chaos, they had helped carve out a space for hope. One afternoon, as Carla was finishing her work in the kitchen, she heard the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned around, expecting to see one of the twins running in, but instead, it was Thomas. He was standing in the doorway, his posture stiff as usual, but his eyes were different today, less guarded, more open. "Carla," Thomas said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that was unmistakable. "I need to talk to you about something." Carla looked up from the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had been expecting this conversation in some form. After all, things had been slowly progressing between them. She could feel the shift in the air, and she knew that he was finally beginning to confront the past he had kept locked away. But still, the heaviness of his tone made her pause. "Of course," Carla replied softly, her heart quickening in her chest. "What's on your mind?" Thomas hesitated, then took a step into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. The sound of the twins playing in the distance reached them both, muffled but unmistakable. "I've been thinking a lot," Thomas began, his voice quieter now, almost himself. "About the house, about everything. About how I've been living my life for the past few years. It's not enough anymore. I can't keep pretending that I'm fine, that I'm just fine with everything being this way." Carla's heart tightened as she watched him, the vulnerability in his voice hitting her harder than she had expected. He was opening up little by little, but it was clear that this wasn't easy for him. It had taken him so long to even begin confronting his grief, to allow someone to witness his pain. I'm sorry, Thomas, Carla said gently, setting the dish towel down. I know it's been hard for you, but you don't have to hide it anymore. Thomas met her eyes. His expression softened, though the weight of his emotions still lingered. I know. It's just, I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how to stop holding on to what's gone. I keep expecting things to go back to how they were, and I know that's not possible. Carla walked closer to him, her gaze steady and compassionate. You don't have to move on all at once. You just have to start taking small steps. That's what you've been doing already. And you've made so much progress, Thomas. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair, the frustration clear on his face. I never wanted to burden anyone with my grief. But I realize now, I've been pushing everyone away, including myself. Carla reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. You don't have to carry it all alone. It's okay to let people in. It's okay to let yourself feel again. For a long moment, Thomas didn't speak. The air in the kitchen felt thick, charged with the weight of unspoken things. Carla wanted to say more, but she held back, knowing that pushing too hard could undo the delicate progress they had made. Instead, she simply stood with him, offering her presence as a silent comfort. The next few days passed quietly. Carla could feel the subtle shift in Thomas, the small steps he was taking toward healing. He started spending more time with the twins, allowing himself to enjoy the simple joy of watching them play in the garden. He still had his moments of retreat when the weight of his grief became too much for him to bear, but he was learning to navigate those moments with less isolation. The twins, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the deeper currents at play in the mansion. They continued to run through the halls, drawing pictures for Mr. Henson and laughing without a care in the world. Their innocence was a balm for the pain that had lingered in this house for so long. One afternoon, as Carla was cleaning the study, she overheard a conversation between the twins and Thomas. She stopped for a moment, listening from the doorway. Mr. Henson, Liam said, his voice full of excitement, we made something for you. Thomas, who had been sitting at the desk, looked up, his expression softening as he saw the boys approach, a bundle of colorful drawings in their hands. For me? He asked, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, Ethan said, handing him the drawings. We want you to be happy, Mr. Henson. So we made pictures of you and the house and even the garden. See, Carla peered into the room, her heart warming as she watched Thomas's reaction. He carefully took the drawings, his hands almost reverent as he looked at each one. The boys had drawn pictures of him smiling, of them all playing together in the garden, their hands holding balloons. The images were simple, full of joy and innocence, but there was something so pure about them that Carla felt her own eyes sting with tears. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Liam, Thomas said quietly, his voice a little hoarse. These are beautiful. Liam grinned, looking up at him with bright eyes. You're welcome, Mr. Henson. You're going to like them. Thomas paused for a long moment, then looked up at Carla, who was standing in the doorway. For a second, their eyes met, his gaze filled with something Carla couldn't quite place. But it wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was warm, open even. And for the first time, Carla realized that Thomas wasn't just allowing himself to heal. He was letting himself hope again. The change, although subtle, was undeniable. It was like the mansion itself had begun to breathe again, slowly, steadily, as if it had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. The weeks that followed were filled with more small shifts in Thomas. The distance that had once defined him began to disappear. There were moments when he would simply sit with Carla and the boys in the kitchen, watching as they ate, listening as the twins chattered on about their day. Thomas even began asking about the twins' school, curious about what they were learning and how they were adjusting. He began to participate in their little games, throwing a ball around in the garden or sitting down with them to help them with their drawings. Though the boys were still young, their influence on him had been profound. It was a Thursday afternoon when Carla finally realized how far Thomas had come. She had been walking through the hallway when she heard the unmistakable sound of laughter coming from the garden. She paused for a moment, listening, and felt a smile tug at her lips. She turned the corner and saw Thomas kneeling on grass, surrounded by the twins, who were showing him something they had found in the garden. He was laughing, genuinely, with a warmth she hadn't seen in him before. And for the first time, the mansion didn't feel cold anymore. The change was no longer just in Thomas. It was in all of them. The mansion had become a place where joy and life could coexist with the past. A place where healing wasn't just a distant possibility, but a present reality. As Carla stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold before her, she realized that she had found something she hadn't expected, something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She had found a home, not just for herself and her boys, but for Thomas as well. And in that moment, with the laughter of the twins and the soft light of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the garden, Carla knew that the future wasn't so uncertain anymore. It was bright, full of promise. And together, they would face it step by step. As the days passed, the mansion transformed completely. The silence that had once enveloped it had been replaced by the sounds of life. Laughter, conversations, even the occasional argument between the twins. And with each passing day, Thomas grew more and more comfortable in his own skin, allowing himself to feel joy again, even if only in small doses. Carla, too, had found her place in this world, her connection to the mansion and its inhabitants becoming stronger with every passing moment. And though the past would always be a part of them all, they had learned to move forward, together. As the seasons changed and the leaves turned from green to gold, Carla found herself more hopeful than she had ever been. For the first time, she saw a future that was full of possibility, a future where healing, love, and family were at the heart of it all. And for the first time, she knew that this house, this mansion, was truly a home. That evening, after the twins had gone to bed and the mansion had settled into its usual quiet, Thomas and Carla found themselves sitting in the kitchen together. They were alone, something that had become more common as time passed. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was companionable, familiar, even soothing. They had grown into this rhythm, this new dynamic. Carla had finished preparing dinner, and they were both eating quietly, but Carla could tell Thomas was deep in thought. "I've been thinking a lot," Thomas began, his voice unusually soft, "about what you said the other day, about not having to do everything alone, about letting people in." Carla set her fork down, her eyes meeting his. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was coming but not knowing when. "I know it's not easy," Carla said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I know you're still processing everything. But you're not alone, Thomas. And you never have to be." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant, like he was trying to find the words to explain the complexity of his feelings. "I've spent so long believing I had to handle everything by myself. It's how I survived after everything. But now, with you and the boys here, it feels different. I feel like I'm maybe ready to change. I don't know if that makes sense." Carla smiled softly, her heart swelling. "It makes perfect sense. Change doesn't happen all at once, but it does happen little by little, and you're already on your way." Thomas sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. "I just don't want to mess things up. I'm not used to this. Not used to having people around, people who actually care. I keep waiting for it to all fall apart." Carla leaned forward, her voice steady. "It won't fall apart, Thomas. Not this time. You've built something here, something real. With the twins, with me, and with you." For a moment, Thomas didn't say anything. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching, as if he were seeing her for the first time, really seeing her. The wall he had kept up for so long had been slowly coming down, piece by piece, and for the first time, Carla could tell that he was starting to believe in what was being built between them. "I don't know how to thank you for being here," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and the boys, you've changed everything. You've made me see that maybe I'm not as broken as I thought I was." Carla reached out across the table, her hand resting lightly over his. "You're not broken, Thomas. You've just been lost for a while, and I'm here to help you find your way back. We all are." The weeks following that conversation marked a quiet but profound shift in the mansion. There were still days when Thomas would retreat into his office, needing time to process the weight of his past. But those moments were fewer and farther between. More and more, he allowed himself to join Carla and the boys in their everyday lives, watching the twin school projects, playing games in the garden, or simply sitting at the dinner table and engaging in the banter that Carla had always dreamed of. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't without its struggles, but it was progress. Carla, too, felt herself changing. She was no longer just working here, cleaning the house and trying to keep things in order. She was becoming a part of something bigger, a family, a community, something that had once seemed impossible but now felt within reach. The twins were growing, thriving, and with each passing day, she felt more connected to them, to Thomas, and to the house that had started to feel like home. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Carla walked into the library, where Thomas was sitting by the large window, his eyes looking out over the garden. The twins were outside, playing in the fading light, and the scene before her felt almost cinematic, a family in motion, caught in a moment of peace. "Do you want to join them?" Carla asked, leaning against the doorway. Thomas looked up at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think I will." And for the first time in a long time, Carla didn't feel the weight of the mansion pressing down on her. Instead, she felt the possibility of a new chapter unfolding, one that was full of hope, healing, and, most importantly, connection. As she watched him join the twins in the garden, Carla knew that the future wasn't just something to survive anymore. It was something to look forward to. Together, they had started to rebuild, and together, they would continue to grow.